The letter arrived on a Tuesday that felt like dying. Elias Boone held the yellowed envelope with hands that had forgotten how to tremble, reading words that shattered his carefully constructed solitude like bullets through glass. His brother Thomas, dead 3 months now, had left him more than land and livestock. He'd left him a family. A wife named Mary Collins and 3 children who would soon call him Father. The mountain man who had spent 15 years learning how to be alone now faced the impossible, learning how to belong. Subscribe to discover how a man who chose death over love finds himself choosing love over everything. The cabin had grown smaller over the years, shrinking around Elias like a coffin he'd built with his own hands. Every morning he woke to the same silence, the same emptiness that had become his closest companion since Gettysburg took his soul and left his body wandering these Colorado peaks. The war had ended 16 years ago, but for Elias Boone it continued in the spaces between his heartbeats, in the dreams that visited him like unwelcome ghosts. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, the way a wounded animal chooses the deepest cave to die in peace. The mountains asked nothing of him except survival, and survival was all he had left to give. The letter from the lawyer in Denver had taken 3 weeks to reach him, carried by a postal rider who looked at Elias's cabin like it was the edge of the civilized world. Perhaps it was. Thomas Boone, his younger brother, had died of consumption, leaving behind a wife and 3 children with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, except the hermit brother he'd mentioned in desperate letters Elias had never answered. The inheritance was simple and devastating, a family that needed him, whether he wanted them or not. The lawyer's words echoed in the thin mountain air. They'll arrive by stagecoach next Tuesday, weather permitting. Weather, Elias thought bitterly, was the least of his concerns. He spent the week preparing like a man preparing for siege. The cabin received its first thorough cleaning in years, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. What did a man who lived like a ghost know about making a home for the living? His hands, scarred from war and weathered by solitude, fumbled with domestic tasks that felt foreign as speaking Chinese. He repaired the broken shutter, patched the holes in the roof, and tried to remember what normal people ate for meals that weren't just beans and hardtack. The mirror above his wash basin reflected a stranger, grey-bearded, hollow-eyed, more spectre than man. Tuesday arrived with the cruelty of answered prayers. The stagecoach appeared through the pine trees like a mirage, dust rising behind it in golden clouds that caught the afternoon light. Elias stood in his doorway, frozen between the urge to run deeper into the mountains and the terrible responsibility that bound him to this moment. The coach stopped, and from it emerged a woman with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow, followed by 3 small figures who clung to her skirts like flowers seeking shelter from a storm. Mary Collins looked at him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily, while the children stared with the wide-eyed curiosity of creatures encountering a legend. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that words couldn't bridge. Elias had rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now, faced with the reality of breathing, living people who needed him, his carefully planned speeches crumbled to dust. Mary stepped forward first, her chin raised with a dignity that poverty and loss couldn't diminish, and extended her hand. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her fingers. "I'm Mary Collins. These are Sarah, James, and Emily." The children pressed closer to their mother, and Elias realized with a shock that cut deeper than any battlefield wound that they were looking at him with something that might, eventually, become trust. The stagecoach driver unloaded their possessions, a single trunk, a few bundles wrapped in cloth, and a wooden crate that clinked with the sound of dishes, and departed with unseemly haste, leaving them stranded in the clearing like survivors of a shipwreck. Elias stood there, this man who had faced Confederate charges without flinching, paralyzed by the simple act of welcoming strangers into his home. But as little Emily stepped forward and looked up at him with eyes the color of summer sky, something long frozen in his chest began to crack, and he heard himself say, in a voice rusty from disuse, "Come inside then. It's getting cold." The cabin transformed overnight from a hermit's refuge into something unrecognizable, a place where children's laughter bounced off log walls that had known only silence for 15 years. Sarah, the eldest at 10, moved through the space with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned too young to be helpful, while 8-year-old James explored every corner with the fearless curiosity of a boy who saw adventure where others saw only rough-hewn furniture and cobwebs. Little Emily, barely 5, had claimed the rocking chair by the fireplace as her throne, chattering to herself in the musical way of children who lived half in reality and half in dreams that adults had forgotten how to dream. Mary worked with quiet determination, transforming chaos into order with the skill of a woman who had learned to make homes from nothing. She swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in months, organized shelves with an efficiency that made Elias feel like a stranger in his own space, and somehow produced meals from his meager supplies that tasted like miracles. He watched her from the corners of his eyes, this woman who had been thrust into his life like a stone, thrown into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of his carefully constructed solitude. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, but her presence filled spaces he hadn't realized were empty. The first night was the hardest. Elias had given up his bed to Mary and the children, spreading his bedroll near the fireplace like a guard dog protecting something precious. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a family settling into rest, Mary's soft humming as she tucked the children in, Sarah's whispered prayers, James's sleepy questions about whether bears lived in the mountains, Emily's contented sighs as she drifted off, clutching a rag doll worn smooth by love. These sounds, so foreign to his ears, seemed to seep into his bones like warmth after years of cold. The children adapted with the resilience that belonged only to the young. Within days, they had mapped every inch of the clearing, discovered the creek that ran behind the cabin, and appointed themselves his assistants in tasks he had always done alone. James followed him like a shadow when he chopped wood, asking endless questions about axes and trees and why the mountains were so tall. Sarah helped Mary with cooking and cleaning, but her eyes often strayed to the books on Elias's shelf, volumes of poetry and philosophy that seemed incongruous in a hermit's cabin. Emily simply existed in the space between them all, a tiny sun around which the rest of them began to orbit without realizing it. But it was Mary who unsettled him most. She moved through his space with a grace that made him acutely aware of his own awkwardness, his own rough edges that 15 years of solitude had sharpened into weapons against intimacy. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight, observations about the weather, gentle corrections to the children, quiet thanks for small kindnesses he offered without thinking. There was a strength in her silence that reminded him of the mountains themselves, enduring, patient, shaped by forces that would break lesser things. He found himself watching her hands as she worked, noting the calluses that spoke of hard labor, the wedding ring she still wore like a talisman against forgetting. The week passed like a fever dream, each day bringing small revelations that chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. Emily's fearless trust as she climbed onto his lap during evening stories, James's pride when Elias showed him how to whittle a whistle from pine wood, Sarah's shy smile when she discovered his collection of pressed wildflowers between the pages of his books, and Mary watching it all with eyes that seemed to see through his gruff exterior to something he had thought dead and buried on a battlefield in Pennsylvania. As he lay by the dying fire that 7th night, listening to the gentle breathing of his unexpected family, Elias Boone realized with a terror that cut deeper than any enemy blade that he was no longer learning how to die alone. He was learning how to live. Escreva os capítulos 3-5. The morning sun carved long shadows through the cabin windows when Emily's fever broke, her small body finally releasing the heat that had consumed her for 3 days. Elias sat beside her makeshift bed, his calloused hands still trembling from the night he'd spent pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead, whispering prayers to a god he'd abandoned on the battlefield at Antietam. The child's eyes fluttered open like butterfly wings, and when she whispered "Papa" in that voice soft as mountain mist, something inside his chest cracked open like ice in spring thaw. Mary stood in the doorway, her own exhaustion written in the dark circles beneath her eyes, but her smile held the kind of gratitude that could resurrect dead men. The days that followed moved with the rhythm of a life Elias had never imagined possible, each hour marked not by the position of shadows on his cabin wall, but by the needs of 3 small souls who had claimed him as their own. Sarah helped him mend the chicken coop with the serious concentration of a child trying to prove her worth, her thin fingers surprisingly deft with hammer and nail, while James followed him to the stream each morning, chattering about fish and frogs and the way water sounded different when it was happy. Emily, still weak from her illness, would sit on the porch wrapped in Mary's shawl, singing nonsense songs to the wildflowers that grew beside the steps, her voice weaving through the mountain air like a melody he'd forgotten he knew how to hear. But it was Mary who unsettled him most, the way she moved through his space as if she belonged there, hanging wash on lines he'd never needed, filling corners with the scent of bread and the sound of humming that made his cabin feel less like a tomb and more like something dangerously close to home. She never asked about the scars that crisscrossed his back or the way he sometimes woke screaming in the night, but he caught her watching him with eyes that held understanding instead of pity, as if she recognized the particular weight that broken men carry in their shoulders. When she brushed past him in the narrow kitchen, reaching for flour or salt, the brief contact sent electricity through his skin that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the terrifying possibility that he might be worthy of tenderness. The children adapted to mountain life with the resilience that only the young possess, turning his solitary routines into adventures that transformed the landscape of his loneliness. They named the old mare Buttercup and convinced him to let them ride her to the meadow where wildflowers grew thick as carpet, their laughter echoing off canyon walls that had known only silence for so many years. Sarah proved herself capable beyond her years, learning to milk the goat and gather eggs with the determination of someone who understood that survival required everyone to contribute. While James discovered a talent for tracking that reminded Elias of his own boyhood, before war had taught him that following trails could lead to death as easily as to game. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat, but instead of the crushing burden he'd expected, it felt more like armor against the emptiness that had been eating him alive for so long. When James cut his hand on a broken jar and came running to him instead of Mary, blood streaming between small fingers, Elias felt something shift inside his chest as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it with strips torn from his own shirt. The boy's trust was absolute, unquestioning, the kind of faith that demanded a man become worthy of it or die trying, and as he kissed the bandaged palm and watched James's tears transform into a brave smile, Elias understood that he was no longer the same man who had climbed this mountain to die. The evening found them gathered around the table Mary had somehow made from rough planks and determination, sharing a meal that tasted like forgiveness and felt like the first real food he'd eaten in years. And when Emily climbed into his lap without invitation, her small head heavy against his chest, Elias closed his eyes and let himself imagine that this fragile thing they were building together might actually survive the winter of his damaged heart. October arrived with the kind of cold that bit through wool and settled in bones, and with it came the nightmares that Elias had hoped the presence of his new family might chase away. He woke on the 15th night screaming about Shiloh, his hands clawing at phantom enemies, while Mary's voice called him back from battlefields where dead boys still walked and cannon smoke never cleared. The children huddled in their beds, wide-eyed and frightened, as Mary knelt beside him in the darkness, her hands gentle on his shoulders, her voice steady as mountain stone as she whispered him back to the present, back to the cabin where no one was dying except the parts of him that needed to die. The shame that followed was worse than the nightmare itself, the knowledge that his broken mind had shattered the peace of innocence who deserved better than a father, haunted by ghosts they couldn't see. Sarah found him the next morning sitting on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at hands that still shook with remembered violence, and instead of fear in her young face, he saw only the kind of fierce protectiveness that reminded him painfully of her mother. She sat beside him without speaking, her small hand slipping into his scarred one, and they watched the sun rise over peaks that had witnessed more suffering than any landscape should have to bear, two souls learning that sometimes healing required nothing more than shared silence. Mary began leaving her bedroom door open after that night, not from invitation, but from the practical understanding that broken men needed watching, and Elias found himself grateful for her vigilance even as it exposed the depth of his damage. She never spoke of her own nightmares, but he heard her sometimes in the small hours, weeping quietly into her pillow for a husband whose name she never mentioned. And he understood that they were both refugees from wars that had ended but never truly stopped. When she caught him listening one night, standing uncertain in her doorway like a man afraid of his own shadow, she didn't turn away in embarrassment, but simply moved over in the narrow bed, making space for his grief beside her own. They lay there in the darkness, careful not to touch, two people learning that intimacy could exist in the space between bodies as surely as in their joining. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper against the mountain wind that rattled the windows. She told him about the fever that had taken her husband, about the way hope could die slowly, day by day, until you found yourself praying for endings instead of miracles. And Elias understood that she had climbed her own mountain of solitude before fate had delivered her to his. Her words painted pictures of a woman who had learned to be strong because weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. And when she asked about his war, he found himself speaking truths he'd never given voice to, about boys who died calling for mothers who would never answer, and the way killing changed the taste of food forever. The children sensed the shift between them. The way grief shared became grief halved, and they began to relax into the rhythm of a family that was learning to function despite the cracks in its foundation. James started bringing Elias small gifts, smooth stones from the creek, feathers from birds he'd found, wildflowers pressed between the pages of the Bible Mary read to them each evening, offerings from a boy who understood instinctively that wounded things needed tending. Emily took to climbing into bed between them on the nights when thunder rolled across the peaks, her small body a bridge between two people who were slowly learning that love could grow in the spaces where pain had carved out room for it. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the mountain in silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. And as Elias stood at the window watching flakes fall like benediction on the graves of his former life, he felt Mary's presence beside him, solid and warm and real. She didn't speak, didn't need to, because they both understood that winter would test everything they'd built together, would strip away pretense and reveal whether the fragile thing growing between them was strong enough to survive the season of dying that was coming for them all. When Emily's voice rose from the kitchen, calling them to see the snow angels she'd drawn in the flour she'd spilled, they turned together toward the sound of childhood joy, and Elias realized that somewhere in the space between nightmare and morning, between grief shared and silence broken, he had stopped preparing to die alone and started learning how to live with others, how to be the kind of man who deserved to be called father by voices that trusted him to keep the darkness at bay. Winter descended on the mountain like a judgment, sealing them into the cabin with snow that piled against windows and wind that howled through gaps in the chinking, like the voices of all the men Elias had left behind on distant battlefields. But instead of the isolation driving them apart, the enforced closeness wove them together with threads stronger than blood, each shared meal and evening story adding another layer to the cocoon they were building against the cold world outside. Mary's presence filled the spaces between his ribs where loneliness had lived for so long, not with passion, but with something deeper and more necessary. The steady warmth of a woman who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier, who saw his scars and nightmares and broken places and decided he was worth the work of loving anyway. The children bloomed in the hothouse atmosphere of the snowbound cabin, their laughter becoming the soundtrack to days that passed like prayers answered by a god. Elias was slowly learning to trust again. Sarah appointed herself teacher to her younger siblings, creating lessons from whatever materials she could find, turning arithmetic into games played with dried beans and geography into stories about places beyond the mountains where people lived different lives but loved their children just the same. James discovered a talent for whittling, his small hands guided by Elias's larger ones, as they carved animals from scraps of wood, each figure a small miracle of patience and concentration that reminded them both that beautiful things could emerge from the most ordinary materials if you were willing to take the time to see what was hidden inside. Emily became the heart of their small world, her presence a constant reminder that innocence could survive even in places where hope had seemed impossible. Her questions about everything from snowflakes to stars, forcing Elias to remember wonder he'd thought the war had killed in him forever. When she asked why the wind sounded sad, he found himself explaining that sometimes the earth itself grieved for all the people who had gone away. And when she asked if the people ever came back, he told her that they did, in different ways, in the love that remained and the memories that refused to die, and the new families that grew from the ashes of old sorrows. The nights were the hardest and the best, when they gathered around the fire that Elias fed with wood he'd cut in preparation for a winter he'd planned to spend alone, the flames casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed only silence for so many years. Mary would read to them from books she'd brought in her single trunk, her voice weaving stories that transported them beyond the cabin walls to places where heroes always won and love always conquered, and families stayed together no matter what storms tried to tear them apart. Sometimes Elias would catch her watching him over the children's heads, her eyes holding questions she was too careful to ask, and he would nod slightly, letting her know that yes, he was still there, still fighting to become the man they needed him to be. The transformation happened so gradually he almost missed it, the way his hands stopped shaking when he held Emily, the way his sleep grew deeper and his dreams less violent, the way he began to plan for spring instead of simply enduring winter. Mary noticed first, commenting one morning that he looked rested, and when he caught his reflection in the window, he saw a man he barely recognized, still scarred, still carrying the weight of things that couldn't be undone, but no longer hollow, no longer waiting to die. The children had filled him with purpose, and Mary had given him permission to hope. And together, they had created something that felt dangerously close to happiness in a place where he'd come to bury himself. When the first thaw came in March, revealing a world reborn beneath the melting snow, Elias stood on the porch with his family around him and understood that he had been given something rarer than gold or land, or any treasure men usually fought over. He had been given a second chance at life, a reason to believe that redemption was possible even for men who had done unforgivable things. And as Emily's hand slipped into his and Mary's shoulder brushed against his arm, he made a promise to whatever force had brought them together that he would spend whatever years remained to him proving worthy of the gift he'd been given. The mountain that had been his intended grave had become his salvation, and the family that inheritance had thrust upon him had become the answer to prayers he'd been too broken to pray. And as spring painted the peaks with wildflowers and hope, Elias Boone finally understood that sometimes the best way to find yourself was to lose yourself completely in the service of others who needed you to be more than you ever thought you could become.